We're at a point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization.
In 2003, the United States declared a win in Afghanistan. The Taliban had been toppled only months after 9/11. After nearly 20 years, the Taliban is conquering now the country as American soldiers have left, and the United Nations raised concerns about record high levels of deaths among children and women. Neither the government nor the international community can confidently announce how much of the country is already under the Taliban's control, but numerous and mostly limited data suggests it is more than half of territory. Since the US announcement about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, the Taliban advances in the country with immense speed, and many people, both inside and outside the country, have been surprised by the scale and speed the Taliban invades the country. Before Biden had ordered troops in Afghanistan to leave, the United States had been trying to exit from Afghanistan for a while. For example, President Barack Obama in his speech delivered on February 12, 2013, had announced that by the end of 2014, the war in Afghanistan will be over. However, after this announcement, the more frequent victories of the Taliban mean that the US will remain in Afghanistan much longer than intended. Despite the United States military presence in Afghanistan, the insurgent group had expected and become much stronger than it has been in the last 20 years. At the beginning of the war, America's campaign in Afghanistan reached some success in just a couple of months. At the time when the US-led coalition invaded Afghanistan, the Taliban had controlled the country for more than 5 years, taking the power in the country following an extremely violent civil war. However, all that changed when President Bush had announced that
on my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
the United States has deployed over 2,500 troops, and soon after the Taliban had retreated from Kabul and Kandahar, the main stronghold of the Taliban. At those times, the Taliban was mostly defeated and members of the terrorist groups started to give up barely without a fight. Some Taliban commanders offered to surrender in return for amnesty, but the United States deteriorated that offer and wanted to fight and stamp out until the last member of the Taliban. In the search for revenge on life, the Taliban regrouped in Pakistan, where they were welcomed, had received shelter and support, intending to return later. Unfortunately, the Taliban's revenge had started before those from Pakistan came back. Taliban began their resurgence, and by the middle of the decade, they have launched hundreds of terrorist attacks in Kabul and other populated cities in Afghanistan, killing not only civilians, but also hundreds of US soldiers. So, to counter the Taliban's new presence in Afghanistan, Obama has declared about deploying more
This review
forces
is now
in
complete.
Afghanistan.
And as Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. After 18 months, our troops will begin to come home. These are the resources that we need to seize the initiative while building the Afghan capacity that can allow for a responsible transition of our forces out of Afghanistan.
And
Good
in
evening.
May 2011, Obama
Tonight,
has announced that
I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
10 years after 9/11, the person who was responsible for the terrorist attack on New York City was killed. By that time, the number of US troops in Afghanistan hit a peak of around 100,000. Meanwhile, numerous policymakers and scholars all around the world have begun to question the effectiveness of that large military presence. Sooner, the US government have found out that the US counterintelligence did not exterminate the Taliban. The strategies that the United States was using in Afghanistan, such as night raids and airstrikes that also sometimes killed civilians, created in local communities contempt, and later on some members of these communities joined the Taliban. After having bin Laden killed, President Obama was facing mountainous pressure from Democratic lawmakers in Congress, so he announced his plan to withdraw some 33,000 troops from Afghanistan and transfer power to the Afghan military. Unfortunately, this plan didn't work well as it was initially calculated. The Afghan security forces were overwhelmed by problems that continued to haunt them, such as corruption, which turned them into an ineffective counterforce against the Taliban, who continued to fight supposedly armed and funded by the Pakistani government. Soon after the US slowly shifted their power presence in Afghanistan, the government has acknowledged problems with effectiveness and corruption among its security forces, but during the press releases told that the corruption is decreasing. Meanwhile, the Pakistani government has denied backing the Taliban, but confess that they have some little influence over the Taliban. The Taliban was continuing to advance its positions and influence inside the country, and this has started to alarm people in the capital. In December 2014, NATO has announced the end of its combat mission in Afghanistan. Some months later, in 2015, the Taliban captured the city of Kunduz. Each step back of the combined NATO mission in Afghanistan was followed by the Taliban's advancements in the country. While locating Taliban's concrete presence has always been tricky in such an unsolidified situation, some analysts have drawn maps based on news reports and social media. According to some analysts, already in 2017, the Afghan government was struggling to hold the Taliban back. The security threats in Afghanistan and the broader region were evaluated as immense, so President Donald Trump has announced about sending additional troops to Afghanistan. However, some journalists cited their interviews with young Taliban, who said that they would consider giving up on fighting once the American troops will leave the country. But once the American president said that he is planning to send more troops, they said there was no way they will give up on fighting. Nearly 4 years afterward, on July the 4th, 2021, the US troops depart from Bagram Air Base, which was their main base of operations in the country. At the same time, the terrorist expansion in the country was accelerating. So far, the United States government's military campaign has accomplished its objectives, but the US airstrikes against the Taliban in Afghanistan will continue. However, for those between the Taliban and the Afghan government, two main questions circulate in society. What are the Taliban plans and whether they can coexist with the Afghan government? Meanwhile, the Taliban's gains in Afghanistan raise too many risks and questions. One, that the country might split possibly along sectarians, which accordingly will drive the country into another bloody civil war. Or that the fundamentalist Islamist groups takes the power in Afghanistan again, which will put the United States' never-ending war in Afghanistan in question.